What is the difference between conservation and preservation? This video is going to define both of those terms, give examples for how they are being used, and talk about the various implications with adopting either of those strategies. So let's hop in. A lot of people get preservation and conservation mixed up, and it's totally understandable as to why. They are often interrelated. However, here I want to explicitly define how each is meant to be used. And as a note, this is going to be largely focusing on the use of the terms conservation and preservation in a Western society such as the US. Of course, terms have different meanings to different cultures in different areas, so thought I'd say that here explicitly. Both conservation and preservation detail how humans interact with natural areas, so areas out in nature. The difference lies in how humans interact with these natural systems. Underneath preservation, humans are not interacting at all with these natural areas. Underneath conservation, we are detailing how humans sustainably interact with natural areas. Imagine a natural area that is completely devoid of human interactions. We do not manage it, we do not extract any resources from it, we don't hike on it, and we do not have any influence over the flora and fauna found there. That would be a natural area managed underneath a preservation mindset. Now imagine that same natural area, however, we do extract resources such as lumber, or we build out hiking trails and roads and infrastructure so that people can enjoy the area, or we directly manage and influence its flora and fauna. Take, for example, removing invasive species. That natural area would now be managed under a system of conservation. You can think of the difference between them as if we were trying to offer some protection to a historical building. Underneath preservation, we would do as little as possible to maintain that building for the long term. We would keep it exactly as it is when we found it. Underneath conservation of that building, we would possibly renovate it. We would make sure it's up to code, while still maintaining what makes it a unique historical building. Now, conservation is an extremely wide umbrella term, and in truth, there are many different conservation strategies. Preservation is generally more restrictive of a term, since it is referring to a natural area where we do not manage it. It is left to be wild, or let nature take its course. So why am I even making this video in the first place? Well, because if you really dive into what conservation is, what protecting our natural areas are, you'll see that there is this weird dichotomy between the two of let nature run its course and let's manage nature for the long term. If we get into the history of these terms, what you'll find is many references to John Muir being the grandfather of the preservation movement. John Muir was a nature philosopher and founder of the Sierra Club, whose actions led to the creation of Yosemite National Park in 1906, put into law by Theodore Roosevelt. However, his belief with nature was that nature was God and should not be ruined by the filthy touch of humans. He really did believe that the best parts of nature should only be accessible for those who are worthy of being in nature. And it is that belief that gives me my segue into the problems that I have with preservation as an ideology. You see, when John Muir was first in Yosemite, he described it as an amazing area, a magnificent natural area, unruined by the touch of humans, which is categorically untrue. He just didn't see the Awanichi people of the area because they had been systematically excluded and slaughtered by the US government. And I'm not just adding that as an aside. This is a problem with preservation as a mindset. You see, there is no such thing as pristine wilderness. There is no such thing as an area untouched by humans, and that's because humans have lived in damn near every corner of the planet for tens of thousands of years. In fact, we have very good evidence that humans, as well as our close cousin the Neanderthals, were modifying our landscapes over 100,000 years ago. What I'm trying to show here is that the idea of preservation hasn't really been achieved in nature, and especially in the modern era of globalization, it is infeasible to imagine true natural areas without human influence. Unfortunately, many staunch preservationists in the modern era often use the rhetoric of ecofascism, which is my biggest problem with the preservation movement as it stands today. Ecofascism being the environmental movement that combines elements of fascism. Often the ecofascist rhetoric centers on overpopulation and the exclusion of groups from nature, usually through forcible means. But unfortunately, the rhetoric that is being used in ecofascism is often the core components of a purely preservationist argument. Now, I can do an entire video on ecofascism and its rise as well as its current use. However, let's talk a little bit more about conservation. Like I mentioned earlier, conservation is very tricky to actually peg down to a single thing of this is conservation, and that's because it's a wide umbrella of different activities, uses, and beliefs. For example, hunting is absolutely a part of conservation. It is a managed activity where we are extracting resources from the environment. In this case, resources is going to refer to the species that live there, the game species that live there. However, another conservation strategy is absolutely maintaining a trail system inside of a national park such that visitors can enjoy the nature and thus extract some resources. The resources here being the space that the trail is needed, the infrastructure to maintain all of the visitors, as well as anything that the visitors leave, touch, or influence in some way. All of those are resources in this conversation. This is where I want to note that we're not discussing the morality of different conservation practices. Whenever someone brings up that hunting is conservation, which I have lots of opinions on that, you'll see one half of the internet go up in arms and say, how could it be for conservation? They're destroying animals. While the other half of the internet is saying, well, no, we've been hunting as humans for tens of thousands of years, and the money from permitting, from outdoor recreation sales, from hunting, fishing, all of that goes directly into conservation. For example, I know a few people got a little mad when I mentioned that oil and gas are part of conservation, and that's purely because, hey, in the US, we have public lands. We have conservation managers for our public lands, and those conservation managers make decisions on the extraction of oil and gas in these public lands. And objectively, oil and gas extraction is bad for species, for nature, for the surrounding areas. However, the conservation managers make decisions because the oil and gas companies may actually and do actually give money for conservation concerns and for destroying one part of nature so that we can save other parts of nature. It's not the best thing, and this brings me into one of my major problems with conservation in the modern era. Money. When we talk about hunting as conservation, for example, we usually only talk about how the money from hunting and fishing and the permitting and everything is going into saving natural areas. When we talk about lumber extraction in a sustainable way, we often throw in how much money and how many jobs that is creating for a local community. Again, when we're speaking about conservation in today's capitalistic society, conservation is really about how much money can an area bring in. When the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, they talked about how they would bring in money from wolf watchers, and they did bring in millions of dollars from wolf watching in ecotourism. This is the same thing of why we have charismatic species that bring in the big conservation donation dollars, right? Like, donate for the elephants, don't donate for all the other hundreds and hundreds of species that exist around the elephants that also need conservation, need protection in some way. Not to mention, there are the negative impacts of conservation that we do for recreation. How many canyons, forests, deserts, how many ecosystems have been flooded for dams? And then we also people pay to recreate in the flooded areas via boat docks and jet skiing and RVing. In fact, there were very early plans to dam the Grand Canyon, and there are talks about how wonderful it would be to have a speedboat going up the Grand Canyon, and you can go from rim to rim in a day, all via the flooding of the Grand fucking Canyon. And I'm not wanting this video to be a negative take on both preservation and conservation. I'm trying to point out that there are various flaws with both. And if we want to have either, we need to work on making them better. When I was learning about conservation and preservation as well, I was learning it from the standpoint of a philosophy, as a culture of conservation and preservation. However, when it was taught to me, when it was spoken about in my classes, it was really talked about as a methodology, as a way of extracting resources for the greatest number of people for the greatest amount of time. And what I want to instill is a culture of conservation. Conservation being where humans interact and coexist with nature. Which, again, going back to human history, is how humans have always interacted with nature. It is no mistake that the vast majority of biodiversity on this planet is actively being conserved by indigenous groups. And why is that? Well, because, like I mentioned, humans have been interacting and changing the landscape for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And it was done so largely in a sustainable way. We did not see forests mowed down to become agricultural developments. We did not see our swamps filled in so that we could fill more suburban home spaces, right? In essence, humans have moved far away from conservation as a coexistence and instead moved towards conservation as extraction of resources. So, how can we change that? How can we? I'm asking. I want to know. Because the only way we can move forward in nature is to coexist with it. We've been extracting its resources almost unchecked for hundreds of years. And it needs to change. But I don't think that change is excluding people and gatekeeping nature only for a select few. What do you think?